This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi everyone, and welcome to a new episode of World to Win. Before we start going into it, please like our video and also subscribe to our channel so you're notified whenever we're posting a new video. And of course, you can also listen to this and all of our previous episodes in any podcast platform that takes your fancy. So that's first things to get out of the way. But then I want to say hello to someone I personally haven't seen in so long. What's up, Toya, my co-host? Haven't seen you in so long.
I know the summer's already started. I haven't seen you in what feels like months. So I'm so glad to be back. What a time to be back too. There's so much going on, so much for us to talk about. I'm sure you've seen the devastating news that we're experiencing here in the US, where women's rights are just being stripped away right before our eyes. Not that we haven't been warning about this and haven't been talking about it, but it's just almost surreal what's going on here in regards to reproductive rights.
Yeah, it's honestly frightening, and I think that's something that women all around the world are feeling. I know that I've seen discussions about this among my friends in Israel, Palestine, but also in England, that people are just looking to the US and saying, if a country like the US can roll back rights that were won decades ago, what is going to happen for us? And I think it's also important to kind of note that this is like a first in a long list of kind of regressive attempts that could come on board, like gay marriage and loads of other things, which is actually really scary to see. And I think it's kind of like, a big kind of example of how we have to continuously fight for our rights. And I think the things that we're seeing in the US now, the protests that you and your section have organized, I think really give this hope that things can change again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we will definitely have our next episode beyond this, but it's not even just, things like gay marriage that could be under attack. It's, we have some of these Republicans talking about, resegregating schools and birth control, things that just seem so like ingrained in these rights that we could never lose. They're, up on the table, but, that's not what today's episode is about. But we should definitely have an episode on this very soon. So make sure, like Yaara said, you subscribe so you can stay up to date on our analysis. But Yaara, what are we talking about today?
Oh yeah, so I think if Roe v. Wade is what everyone's talking about right now, the second thing that everyone's talking about is how expensive everything is. And I think that we know, if you look back even a year from now, I remember I just posted on Facebook, literally exactly almost to the day a year ago, that I got my first dose of the vaccination. Everyone was talking about how everything is going back to normal after the COVID economic crisis, how we're all going to be at a very different place in 2022. And that obviously was because of the vaccinations, but also the way that kind of the economy progressed, and also the lockdowns ending and all of that. So things, according to bourgeois economists, were looking up. But then it seemed like since then we've had every few weeks another blow. And I think, we don't really need bourgeois economists to tell us this. I think, I don't know about you, but this is what everyone's talking about in my workplace, how everything's rising in costs, but our wages are staying the same or even technically going down. And it's just like, it's noticeable. It's beyond just, numbers on the screen. It's noticeable how much more we're paying for everything now.
Yeah, I mean, here you are in some places like California, the price of gas for 1 gallon is almost as high as the federal minimum wage. I mean, it's just insane. Groceries are going up, but it's hard to even talk about it with people because, a lot of my coworkers, they're saying, oh, well, it's Biden. The economy wasn't like this with Trump, or it's the war in Ukraine. That's the reason that gas prices are so high. So I'm really excited for our guest today to kind of dive into exactly why this is happening with the economy, and what we can, see in the coming future.
Yeah, and I think it's one of these things that there's so many factors that are going into it. There's obviously the war in Ukraine, the general supply chain issues, labor shortages. There's so many factors that are going into why this is happening, and it's very rare to hear conversations about why it's happening from a perspective that isn't, the ruling class trying to tell us that we should just pay more and that nothing can be done about it. So I'm very excited to introduce two of our guests who are both seasoned guests on Well to Win. First, we have Claire from England, Wales, and Scotland. How are you doing, Claire?
Good, thank you. How are you, Yaara?
I'm good. I'm wondering, what have you been up to recently?
Well, I've been involved in supporting the strikes which are going on in Britain at the moment. So rail workers have been out on strike, and I think we'll probably come back to this a little bit during this discussion because it's all about the cost of living crisis, workers' wages not keeping pace with inflation, and workers organising to try and push back against that. So it's been really important. There's been huge trade union demonstrations, picket lines. We've even had barristers and lawyers out on strike in Britain over the last few days. So it feels like things are really hotting up. And yeah, I've been going out with Socialist Alternative, building support for that, visited picket lines, all those things.
It's been really exciting here, actually, to see also, I think, the public response to these strikes as well. I think when I went to work on one of the strike days, everyone in my workplace were really angry that they needed to go into the office, saying, "What? We wanted to support the rail workers, and we couldn't because we had to come into work," which I think is a huge shift. So that's going to be really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to hear more about this. But we also have another guest that you all know and love, Tom from our US section. How are you doing, Tom?
I am not too bad. Yaara, how are you?
I'm good. So what have you been involved in the last week, in the last couple of weeks?
Well, I mean, you've already talked about it in a sense because the whole U.S. organization has been very focused on preparing for Day X and, what we expected would happen, but still it's extremely shocking what did happen when it finally happens. And here in New York, there were 20,000 people out in the streets on Friday, and that was actually a protest that Socialist Alternative played a key role in organizing, and we emceed it, and so forth. So that is extremely important that all of that was very visible. But of course, the question is what to do now, and so I'm involved in a lot of discussions about what the next steps are.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's so important, and it sounds so exciting, even if it's completely frightening to be involved in these demonstrations right now. So again, really looking forward to maybe hearing a little bit about this at the end of the episode. But I want to start kind of with a question, because I think what Toya said about the war and all of these things, I think is a major factor. And we have even had an episode about this relatively recently, about the impact of the war on the economy. But at the same time, some economists were very quick on the trigger, saying that it's going to be temporary, and after a few weeks, the economy will get back on track. So I was wondering, Claire, can you kind of explain what the impact of the war actually is on the economy, and why are we still seeing this impact?
Thanks, Yaara. So I think, first of all, whenever we're talking about the war, it seems appropriate to recognise that the immediate impact that it's having is to cause tremendous suffering, first and foremost, obviously, to the people who are living in the Ukraine or who have had to flee Ukraine. And obviously, we're not going to go into great detail on that, but I do feel like that's important to say, first of all. But obviously, the ramifications go far beyond the very immediate. And I think it's worth revisiting some of what we've discussed previously about the context for the run-up to this war, which I think was this increasing division of the world into two competing economic and political spheres, and we've described this as a new Cold War. Obviously, it's a lot less cold now than it was when we first started talking about it. And that was a really important, and is an important, historic change from a period that preceded this one of unprecedented globalization. And that's obviously founded on the inbuilt contradictions of capitalism. Despite its tendency to want to bring more and more of the world into one global market, it still relies for its rule. The capitalist class still rely for their rule on the nation state, and they're unable to really overcome those limits. And in the recent period, particularly driven by the way in which the US has started to see Chinese capitalism as a threat, we've seen this redivision of the world. And that was part of what led up to this conflict. And in some ways, the war can be seen as a sort of a proxy for this bigger conflict which is brewing and which is going on across the world. And this is just one aspect of that. So the war is part of that. It's come in that context, but it's also itself played a role in accelerating that trend and accelerating it very rapidly. And it's got lots of different economic impacts. So first of all, the literal physical effects of the war on the economy in the Ukraine are very important. Up to 12 million people, as we know, have been forced to flee. There have been major cities which have been essentially razed to the ground. There's an inability to move goods around. There's been the destruction of crops and so on. And those effects in and of themselves are significant. Obviously, people know these statistics, but Ukraine is described as Europe's breadbasket, Asia's breadbasket. It's estimated that before the war, the country, just Ukraine, had the capacity to potentially produce enough food to feed up to 500 million people. So the massive impact that the war will have had on the ability of Ukraine to produce that kind of grain is massive. Obviously, then you've got to add into that the effects of the sanctions on Russia, which of course is a major exporter of oil, of grain, of lots of key commodities. And there's been this huge array of commercial restrictions which have been brought in by Western governments around the world in order to supposedly punish Putin's regime. Of course, in reality, these sanctions are having huge effects, primarily actually not on oligarchs and members of the ruling party in Russia, but on working class people. And I think the IMF's published an article recently which said that sweeping sanctions against Russia have combined with this worldwide supply chain crisis and the wartime disruption of Ukrainian trade to deliver a uniquely powerful economic shock. And the price of oil hit an 8-year high in March, which followed on immediately from the invasion, and it stayed roughly around that level since. And of course, the impact of all of this is, along with the general ratcheting up of this new Cold War, the combination of that with the lockdowns and so on, which are still ongoing because of coronavirus, is huge pressure on especially the supply of some of the most basic necessities that people need. So food, fuel, and those kinds of things. And that is contributing to this massive increase in the cost of living, which is a feature all around the world.
Yeah, Claire, you talked about the destabilization that we're seeing because of this war, and we have an episode or two on the war if you want to get into a little bit more about the effects and learning a little bit more about on the ground what they were doing in Russia to try to fight back. Please check out some of our previous videos. But what you're saying makes sense. But even before the war, we saw huge supply chain issues, especially during the pandemic. This was really brought to light when people, needed things like masks, or even if we want to talk about the vaccine not being able to get around the world. And so, we don't want to make it seem like before the war, everything was rosy. And I'm not saying that's what you said, Claire, but, like I said earlier, all my coworkers, they're constantly saying it wasn't like this before, but it was. Things were building up before this war. We saw signs of strain and big disruptions in trade, in particular trends towards deglobalization, decoupling, reshoring. I'm using some economic terms here, Tom, and I'm hoping that you can explain them a little bit more and what these things, what they mean and what they say about the world economy and the geopolitical situation right now.
Yeah, so I think the best way to look at this is to think about the period that we call the neoliberal era that basically stretched from the beginning of the 80s, arguably to very close to the present time, but let's say to the beginning of the pandemic or maybe 2008. And that period, let's say from 1980 to 2010, was characterized by a huge expansion of world trade. And that's what is commonly associated with this term globalization, that the world economy became, an even bigger feature of economic activity. And one of the things that was done was to systematically reduce the barriers to the movement of capital. So you had these free trade agreements, like in North America, the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, that basically was to facilitate a greater trade. And that process then meant that production was quote unquote offshored, or a significant amount of it, from the rich countries. So that meant that a lot of the goods that were being consumed in the US and Western Europe were then being made in China, and then eventually in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Every sort of consumer good, but also automobiles, were being made in Mexico and in China, and so on and so forth. Now, deglobalization is a feature of what we're seeing now, and it doesn't mean that, the world economy just stops functioning. But there's many signs that point to how things have radically shifted. Even before the pandemic, there was a slowdown of trade as a part of the total economic activity. And I think everybody remembers this. Like, obviously you had Trump, accelerating protectionism, imposing tariffs on China. But even that wasn't the beginning. Even under Obama, there was an increase in protectionist activity of basically putting up restrictions to trade. And so we are in the midst of a serious shift towards something that's more akin to maybe what existed in the 1930s, maybe not quite as extreme as that yet. So when we talk about reshoring, and it relates to what Claire was saying about the geopolitical conflict between the US and China, you have to take the US example. They're very focused on and it's not just, one political party. It's the whole establishment and ruling class want to bring back to the US critical sectors of production. So, for example, semiconductors. At the moment, a very large part of semiconductor production is in Taiwan. They don't feel that's very safe, of the high-end semiconductors. So there's big plans to expand semiconductor production in the US. And what this means is then the breakup of one global supply chain into several regional supply chains that are centered on key countries like China, the US, Germany. So reshoring is literally bringing the production back to your own country, which they are going to do or are trying to do with certain critical sectors, or nearshoring it, putting it in what they would consider as a more safe place. So in the US context, that'd be Mexico, for example. So I hope that explains a bit.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, that makes sense. Also, though, something that a lot of people are talking about right now is the idea of inflation. And prices are, just going up, and everyone has, all of these solutions for how to, fight back on inflation. But what exactly is inflation? How do we explain, where it comes from?
Well, this is a complicated question, and the current inflation actually has a number of causes, and some of them are what Claire was talking about. The war has accelerated it, but then it was already, rooted in things like supply chain chaos. But in a more basic sense, one part of what can cause inflation in the capitalist economy is that the money supply grows. So if they're pumping a lot of money into the economy and that is not matching the production of goods and services, then that money is bound to become worth less, not literally worthless, but worth less. So that will inflate prices. The other thing that can happen is that the supply of goods is not meeting the demand. And we should always stress when we talk about supply and demand is not that you have a need. If you're starving to death, and as many people are facing hunger in the world today due to, like the war in Ukraine, they have no demand. They have a need, a terrible need, but demand is only when you have money to pay for things. Otherwise, you have none. So we have both things going on right now, and both features that I was explaining. The money supply issue goes back to the policies that have been implemented in the West since 2008. So when the economy crashed in 2008, their solution to this was to pour trillions of dollars, literally trillions of dollars, into the markets. And they had a particular mechanism to do this called quantitative easing, which we should not try to go into, but that's the basic idea. They poured money in, they propped up the markets, and they let ordinary people suffer. Millions lost in the US, lost their homes, their jobs. There was massive austerity. They did nothing for ordinary people, but they made sure, as you may recall, like that the banks wouldn't collapse. That was the key thing. And so they did save the system through doing this. But the one consequence was, and in fact, it was like the goal was to, bubbles had burst. They were reflating the bubbles. They were, but creating the condition for new crises by, which we're seeing today with things like crypto and property bubbles, being very big again. Then in 2020, you have the pandemic, and the solution to the economic crisis that this triggered was a little bit different in that, whereas in 2008, it was strictly a financial crisis that was triggering the whole thing. In 2020, there was a financial crisis, but there was also this huge collapse of demand because everybody had to stay home. So many people lost their jobs. So they had no money. So they had to, what they did was partly what they did in 2008, pouring trillions in to the markets, but also putting some money into the pockets of ordinary people, far less than they put into into small businesses and especially big businesses. But that stimulus was also part of it. So pouring all this money in, ultimately, it took a while, but it fed into the real economy. In the 2010s, you didn't see it affect the real economy because they were just using this money to play in the casino. They weren't using it to invest in building the economy. But now it has seeped through. But the other thing that happened, again, as a result of the pandemic, but not just, is the supply chain problems. There was huge demand for goods, but because of lockdowns, which have been referred to in China, and other factors, the supply was not meeting the demand. So you have all of these things that are contributing to what we're seeing now.
Thank you, Tom. I think this was a really good explanation of inflation. I think very clear about a very complicated economic term. But one thing that I think we hear all the time when it comes to inflation, and this time I think even more, we saw even like Boris Johnson talking about a wage price spiral, basically meaning that if wages go up, or like if workers demand the wages to go up, then inflation would get even worse because the kind of owners will have to raise prices. So I was wondering, in the context of what Tom just explained, Claire, can you kind of tell us if that's actually the case? Like, if we get higher wages, does that mean that prices will go up anyway, so it wouldn't really matter?
Yeah, I think we've been hearing this ad nauseum really in Britain, particularly linked to this historic strike wave, and particularly the rail strike that's going on in Britain right now. And workers are being urged by the likes of Boris Johnson, multimillionaires, of course, to show restraint and not to demand higher wages. And the argumentation is that if workers get a pay rise, then that will encourage the market to put prices up, and companies will pass wage rises on to consumers, and this will create, as has been said, a wage price spiral and massively compound the problem of inflation. And I think that, first of all, this would have an awful lot this would have potentially a bit more credibility, or would get more of a hearing among ordinary people, if wages had actually risen at all over the last periods. And of course, the actual reality is that wages have not been rising. Average household disposable income in the UK fell by 1.75% last year. Inflation is estimated to be about 11% now in Britain. And wage rises are nowhere near that figure. So in reality, that means people's pay is not just not rising, it's actually being cut and seriously eroded all of the time. And that's not even something which has just got going. It's part of a long-term trend. So if you just take one example, teachers in Britain, if you look at their pay starting from 2007 and compare it to today, they've lost 8%. So in that period, their wages have gone down by, almost, 8%, a huge amount. And wages have been in decline or stagnant for that whole historical period since 2008 and so on. And workers' wages are not a central driver of inflation, as I've said. But actually, even if workers were to be getting pay rises at the moment, so let's say some of these strikes are successful. Let's say workers do start to get their fair share, that they do start to fight back and are able to wrest decent pay rises off some of their employers. What will the effect of that be economically? And we would say that workers' wages are not a central driver of inflation, even when they are going up, because of the simple fact that when workers get paid, they tend to spend their money, and they do that usually quite rapidly after they receive it. And that means that the money that goes to wages tends to be quite rapidly ploughed back into the economy. And if anything, it tends to stimulate more production. So it doesn't have the effect of driving up prices. And of course, even this idea that companies can just mechanistically increase prices when they have been forced to pay workers a rise is not true. One of the effects of the fact that there is a certain degree of competition within capitalist economy means that it's very difficult for companies to do that. If one company deals with a pay rise by putting up prices, and another deals with it by reducing their profit margins, then the one which has done so by putting up prices will face the fact that customers will choose the one that's cheaper, basically. So it's not as simple for them as just passing on increased wages to the consumer in the way that it's presented to us. And of course, when it comes to necessities, it's just patently ridiculous, the idea that the reason why we're having these massive increases now in fuel prices, food prices, and so on, is that people are, just gratuitously going on some kind of hedonistic binge and, going back, driving around the roundabout several times so that you can go and fill up your car again with fuel, or, putting their central heating on in the summer. That isn't what is driving this. It's not the fact that people are suddenly wanting because they've got loads of money or cash around to spend it. It's actually not that at all. And I think that the vast majority of workers can see that. Where there is actually a lot of money sloshing around, in a sense, has actually been in profit. So if you look at what's happened over the last periods, wages have been stagnant. But if you take the example of Britain up until the end of 2021, so during that period of the pandemic, when actually vast majority of workers took a major pay cut during that period, or were thrown out of work, had to get by on benefits or welfare, half of firms in Britain during that time retained or increased their profit margins compared to pre-pandemic levels. And if you look at some of the largest non-financial companies, we see that aggregate profits actually surged in that period by over 34%. So it does relate to those other questions that have already been touched upon of, huge stimulus, huge liquidity being poured into the economy. But there's also the question of where that went, and it didn't primarily go into the hands of working class people. Only a third of it, roughly, in America, I think, is thought to have landed up in people's pockets. And huge amounts of it went into essentially hoardings of the banks, of big business, of large capitalist companies, and so on. And it hasn't been invested in new technology, technique, production, and so on. And that's really what's going on.
Claire, I'm so happy you said it, because I swear I'm blue in the face talking about this when people are talking about gas is $5 a gallon, gas is $6 a gallon. Well, how much did ExxonMobil make last year? And if you look back 5-6 years ago, the price of a barrel of oil was more expensive than it is now. So how does that work? It's mind-boggling to see the profits that were made, and at the beginning of the pandemic, when we started World to Win, seems like so long ago, that was one of the things we talked about, how profits were rising, especially among companies like Amazon, for example, who, their workers were keeping the economy, keeping the economy going, but keeping people going, delivering groceries, etc. And, those owners, those CEOs, they made so much money during this time. I'm so glad you talked about that, Claire. But I want to go a little bit back in history because, they say history repeats itself, whatever. But this period that we're in, we have seen this before in the 1970s where, it was a time of high inflation, but the economy itself wasn't growing. And so, Claire, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what happened during that time. And, we know the 1970s to be a really kind of historic time period for, rights of workers, of Black people, of women. The labor movement was thriving during this time, something that we're seeing a little bit of similarity in like that fighting spirit in this time. So can you talk a little bit about that history and how that can help shape our perspectives for today?
Yeah, well, first of all, I've noticed that I've been given the 1970s question, but perhaps Tom, who probably remembers it a bit better than me, having been alive at the time, might want to add to it.
Tom, she just called you out. Okay, go ahead, Claire. Finish it up.
But I do hopefully have a few things to say about it nonetheless. So, as we know, the 1970s came really at the end of what had preceded it, which was the post-war boom. And it was a period of acute crisis for capitalism. But as you kind of touched on, Toya, it was also a time when workers in general were well organised around the world. They were well organised industrially. They also, in many countries, had political organisations which, at least to some extent, were forced to represent their interests politically, although that was something which started to be eroded. And they were able to mount struggles to defend their conditions and to fight attempts to depress wages. And inflation, in some ways, at that time, acted as a spur to some of those workers' struggles. And I think we're actually, in some ways, seeing a potential glimpse of that today, where Britain is one example, but it's not just here. We're seeing in the US attempts and some successful attempts at unionisation by groups of casualised and low-paid workers in Amazons and Starbucks. In Belgium, over the last period, there's been a massive general strike. And yeah, from my perspective here, we're seeing a growing momentum at this moment in time developing behind this strike wave there is. And there is a parallel there, I think, with the 1970s. And of course, another parallel with the 70s is this attempt by the ruling class to make workers pay for their own crisis. And part of, by say their own, I mean the ruling class's crisis. And the kind of medicine which is being proposed at the moment, which I think we're going to get into in a minute, is quite similar in many ways to some of the ideas that were pushed in the 70s. So, for example, this drive to put up interest rates, which in a sense is a way of deliberately pushing economies towards recession. The idea is you hike up interest rates, you depress demand, you stop workers having enough money to spend. And that in turn causes the economy to shrink. It increases unemployment. It reduces, because of the fact that there are less workers out there looking for jobs. There are more workers out there looking for fewer jobs. It reduces the bargaining power that workers have. So it helps to further depress wages. And that this is somehow the medicine for inflation. And of course, the 1970s were the period which we look back on now as marking something of a beginning for the neoliberal era. And it's important to, look back on that for some of those lessons. But I think also it's important for us to think about the ways in which it's not like the 70s today. So we have been through 2 decades in which the confidence of workers generally in the capitalist system has been massively undermined, and in which socialist ideas have begun to resurge, in which many of the main political and social institutions which capitalism rests on have faced crisis. And so I do think that the scope for the ruling class to use this period to change the balance of class forces in their favour, which is what they attempted to do in the 70s with some, ultimately with some success. I think that their ability to do that in this period is not the same. And in fact, it's possible for this to be a period in which workers are able to reassert their power and to begin to fight back in an effective way and win decent concessions and obviously win better conditions for themselves.
Yeah, I think another thing that we always kind of need to consider is the fact that the ruling class, the capitalist class, is not just, waiting for it to pass as it sometimes seems, but they're obviously scrambling for solutions and trying everything in the book to kind of solve this. And it looks like most of the central banks around are now talking about raising interest rates. So I was wondering, Tom, can you explain first of all what interest rates are and why raising them is perceived as a solution? But also, how is that different to the way in which central banks dealt with these recurring crises before?
Well, I think that Claire started to explain this, and just to reiterate, because I think it's not something that certainly in Western countries most of us have experienced in a very long time. We've not had inflation like this in the US or in Western Europe basically in 40 years. So, therefore, in some ways, for most people, it is a new experience. So it was already referred to. I do remember the recessions at the beginning of the 80s, which were vicious recessions that were caused by the sharp raising of interest rates. And it was, as Claire said, very deliberate. But the idea is that by raising interest rates, you are raising the cost of borrowing. So for ordinary people, like the cost of buying a house or any major purchase. But it's also the cost of doing business, of expanding your business. So then, you raise interest rates enough, businesses will not expand or take on, new projects. And so that then contributes to ultimately laying people off and and can absolutely trigger a recession. So the question about how this differs, well, this kind of goes back to what the neoliberal era was like. It was an era basically of low interest rates and low inflation. And it was facilitated by having this globalized economy, all these cheap goods that were flooding in from China and South Asia into the US, Western Europe, and so forth. They were able to keep inflation very low, keep interest rates very low. But basically, this whole project came crashing to a halt in 2008. But in 2008, they were still, as I was explaining earlier, the measures that they took to deal with that financial crisis, what they did was they actually lowered interest rates even further. They went to negative interest rates in a number of countries, which is essentially like saying, please take, because these are, the rates for banks. Please take the money. We'll pay you to take the money. So now, again, as Claire said, we have a situation that has some elements that are comparable to the 70s. Not every element, but this inflation thing is something they are absolutely very worried. Many capitalist commentators are very worried about it becoming ingrained, about the expectation of inflation. And then that, you have an extended period of high inflation. They were debating last year whether this would be a temporary feature that would sort itself out, when the supply chains went back to normal. Well, first of all, they didn't go back to normal. And for a whole set of reasons, it has not, it's not a temporary feature. That's very, very clear. So the calls to take action, from the capitalist side are very clear. And as Claire also pointed out, one of the things about inflation that does spook the capitalists is the fear that it's going to lead to class struggles. As people see their wages literally shrink in front of them, when they go to the grocery store and do anything, then the motivation to start fighting back is very real. And already we see a lot of workers who want to fight. In many, many countries, there have been important strikes. So raising the interest rates now is also, if you look at the financial pages, they'll say it's like the end. It's not just raising the interest rates, it's also stopping these other, bond buying programs and whatever. It's the end of the era of easy money, which is this whole period that I was describing from 2008, which got accelerated by the pandemic. So it's a big shift that they are undertaking. But the one other thing I want to say is in the neoliberal era, the dominant kind of ideology that was used in dealing with these things was called monetarism. And it was the idea that, well, if you have problems in the capitalist economy, you can sort it out by basically, you can stop printing money. That was kind of a very shorthand explanation. But then we have people who are Keynesians, and today there's folks who adhere to what's called modern monetary theory, and their proposition is the opposite, that we should basically keep spending money, spend it on social programs and so forth. That sounds good, but their view is that somehow this will prevent crises. And so the monetarists, who are generally right-wing, the MMT people who are more left-wing, but they both are looking for a way to prevent capitalism, from having profound crises. But actually, it's not possible. Capitalism is a boom-bust system. And every time, they get to a point where there's a big period of growth or whatever, people start saying, well, see, now we've overcome this. It hasn't been overcome. And every time you get into a deep crisis, again, as Claire said, the solution is basically the same. Make the working class pay for the crisis of the system. That's what they did in 2008, but not through raising interest rates. But that's what they're going to do this time through raising interest rates. They're going to push the economy over the edge.
So Tom, like the raising of the interest rate, I feel like this is something that people understand and talk about. If I want to buy a house now, it's going to be so much more expensive. If I want to refinance my house, I can't do it. I'm going to owe more than I took my mortgage out for, etc. But what are the effects of raising interest rates globally? We've been talking a lot about the conditions in the US and Europe, but globally, what effect will that have? Is a recession inevitable?
Well, maybe not in every country, but just to cite one thing, the IMF is predicting already economic slowdowns in 143 different countries. So, inflation is rampant. It's much worse, in many countries in the poorer parts of the world than it is even in Western Europe and the US. And so what that, of course, means for ordinary people who, in those countries whose budgets are even more about buying food, if it's inflation in food, then, their ability to even feed themselves is becoming more and more constricted. So, yes, economic slowdowns, huge problems already, even if food is available, in buying food because it's become more expensive. But then on top of that is the effect of raising interest rates in the US and in Western Europe on the debt crisis. So I think the figure is $5 trillion that is now basically owed by poor countries just to private companies. It's not just to the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. So many countries are, drowning in debt, and a lot of that debt is denominated in dollars. So if you raise interest rates in the US, then that's going to make it more expensive for those countries to repay those debts. And that's a catastrophe. So that literally means then they wind up cutting social services and other forms of support for their own population. So where we are heading globally in many countries, you can already see it in Sri Lanka. I think yesterday or the day before, they literally banned any sale of petrol for private use. So basically nobody can drive their car now in Sri Lanka. It's just it's a collapse in that country. And it's a result of corruption, but it's also the result of the debt and inflation, the whole thing combined. So Sri Lanka could be the story in many other countries. And let's not forget what happened 10 years ago when price of food went up sky high. That then triggered the rebellions in North Africa and Middle East that we call the Arab Revolution.
I think there's so many kind of different ways to handle these crises that you've just talked about, Tom. And I think that it's also so confusing because there's so many terms that maybe a bit difficult to understand, especially when we keep on hearing them all the time. But in different contexts and different kind of situations of economic crises. And it kind of seems like what Marxists have been saying for hundreds of years now, that capitalism is a system of crisis, is kind of showing itself more and more in the last few years, especially, and the last few decades generally as well. So we see how, like you both have kind of mentioned, the capitalist class has different solutions and they're all kind of fighting over what the best solution is going to be, and there's no agreement, but the only agreement is that it's going to be within the confines of the capitalist system. But if the system is so crisis prone, then is there going to be a real solution within capitalism? And I was wondering, can you kind of tell us what we as Marxists see as a solution to the economic crisis now, and generally to economic crises that we're seeing over and over again under capitalism?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, our starting point, which really is the same and it's always like a slogan that we use whenever there's a crisis for capitalism, is the idea that workers must not be made to pay. And I think that's an idea which we're going to keep coming back to over the next period, as these demands for workers to accept falling wages and higher interest rates and all of these different squeezes on their living standards, on their ability to just get the basic things that they need in life, continue. And actually, beyond just saying that workers shouldn't have to have their living standards eroded over the next few years, well, we say that working class people, as was talked about, just a few months ago, politicians were still eager to talk about how brilliant the health workers and logistics workers and all of those kinds of people had been during the pandemic, the key workers who got us through, how important their role was within society, and even used slogans like "Build Back Better," pointing towards the idea that there'll be, a brighter future coming out of the pandemic. Well, we always knew that that was a lie coming from those pro-capitalist politicians. But we do think that working class people deserve a decent future. And there's clearly the basis for that. We live in a world which is one in which there's stupendous wealth, all concentrated in the hands of a tiny minority of people. In fact, you have, greater polarization of wealth in the world today than there's been probably at any other point in the whole of human history. It's really staggering. And we think that it's the capitalist system, the chaotic capitalist system, which is ultimately to blame for this. And it's this system which is destroying the planet, that's driving us towards a future of poverty, of famine. All of these things are a reality for people, for millions of people around the world. And there is a force in society, we say, that offers a way out, and that is the united, multiracial, multigendered, international working class. That's because of the role that workers play in society, which I touched on talking about the pandemic. They make goods, provide services, distribute things all over the world. They keep society running. And when they stand together and unite, they can have huge, huge power. And we're seeing that with some of these movements that are taking place and strikes, where workers are able to bring countries to a standstill in some cases based on their collective action. And that points to the fact that actually the kind of speculators, the gamblers, the profiteers, the capitalists, their role in society is not really a useful one. It's not necessary. It's workers who produce society's wealth. And socialism is quite a simple idea, really. It's the idea that working class people can run society themselves, that the working class should be the next ruling class in a sense. And we stand for the bringing into public ownership of the big monopolies that currently dominate the economy around the world, and putting the economy in the hands of working class people under democratic working class control in the workplace, control at local, at regional, at national, and ultimately an international level by working class people, a democratic plan to produce things. And on that basis, a socialist basis, it should be possible to meet people's needs without destroying the planet, and without bringing humanity to the brink of destruction and so on, as we're seeing at the moment. So we stand for socialist change, and I think that that's a demand which is going to increasingly get an echo amongst working class people over the next period as they face that struggle to survive that we're all in.
Thank you so much, both Claire and Tom, for coming on our show today. It's great to see you again and to talk about this really important topic. And we were able to kind of dive through and debunk a lot of what we see in the corporate media. So thanks, and hopefully you're on again real soon.
Wow, this was a lot to take in. But I'm always glad to have these economic episodes. I feel like I always leave with a lot more understanding of the situation. But Toya, it's the first time I have you here in over a month, and I have loads of questions to ask you about Roe v. Wade. So obviously, as everyone could probably guess, our Shoutout of the week this week is going to be to send solidarity to the US with the attacks on bodily autonomy. But as we also talked about a little bit before, it's not just, the attacks on abortion rights. It can grow and manifest in many, many other ways. And, I think it's very clear that we're all sending huge solidarity to everyone in the US, but especially to the members that we have in the US who are now fighting this. And we are very lucky to have Toya here to ask you, so what is actually been going on? What is the fight back like? What are you doing?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, we're going to get into this in another episode, but this is a huge precedent that has been set. It's the first time ever that a constitutional right that had been given to us by the Supreme Court is taken away, which in a sense kind of makes you think, well, what's the point of this court then if they can just make something and take it away? But it's, 50 years of pregnant people being able to make a choice about their own bodies. And so now we're seeing, somewhere around 20 something states are not going to be able to receive abortions. Oftentimes it's life-saving care. And so Socialist Alternative, we've been talking about this for a while, been preparing for what we called Day X, which was the day that they decided to take away our rights. We immediately hit the streets across the entire country. Tens of thousands of people came out. As Tom mentioned earlier, in New York City, there were 20,000 people. AOC was even tweeting about our event. It was huge. And it was a really exciting time. Hundreds of people have come, wanting to join Socialist Alternative. And so if you're watching this in the US and you want to join, you are not alone. There are so many people that want to join our organization. And, the protests have had very different characters. In the state that I live in, abortion probably is not going to be taken away anytime soon. But, we have members that live in Texas, and that's one of the first states that it's taken away. Even all abortions, doesn't matter, 6 weeks, nothing, all abortions taken away. We held this amazing protest where actually, an establishment politician, Democrat Beto O'Rourke, came to speak, and basically we were chanting at him because, the Democrats have done nothing to actually codify this into law. They've had 50 years to make this an actual law, and they didn't. And, the chants went on so much that he couldn't even speak. He had to get taken off stage. It was amazing. Just the energy to fight back against this is insane.
Yeah, and I think what amazed me the most, like obviously beyond the incredible demos that have been going on, I think is kind of like the clear kind of working class solidarity that people have. Like I've seen so many posts on social media of people saying, if you need an abortion, come and I'll host you because I'm in a state that will still have abortion. And it's just so incredible to see kind of this solidarity that exists and how we're taking it a step forward with fighting back against it. And, the things about the Democratic Party, I think it's very clear to so many people that, like, especially now that they've been talking about codifying Roe v. Wade for so long and they haven't done it. Even in, presidencies that relied on codifying Roe v. Wade as like the main kind of election priority or whatever, still hasn't happened. And now we're seeing kind of, obviously, even if it was codified, it would be able to be taken away. But now it's because it wasn't codified, it was so much easier. And now there's this insane mess of so many of these laws that can be revoked. So it's so crazy to see that that's happening. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about kind of the demands that Socialist Alternative is putting forward in these demos, because I'm sure you're not only chanting away Democrats off the stage.
So fun though. Yeah, I mean, like, the reality is we just lost, a basic right, bodily autonomy under a Democratic president, under the first woman vice president. We have so much to say about that and how the Democrats are just lacking. And so some of the demands, especially in places like where I live, where we can't call on the governor to change it or the state legislature because, in many states, like in Seattle, Washington, with our elected official, Shama Sawant, we're putting forward things like not allowing extradition from other states. So, for example, if a doctor performs an abortion in Texas and flees to a different state, not allowing an arrest to happen. Things like that are happening already, but we're calling on Biden to actually take action. So in states where abortion is now illegal, giving access to abortion on federal land, that is run by the federal government so that women are still able and pregnant people are still able to get that life-saving care or, their choice of healthcare. And we're also calling on Biden to get rid of the Hyde Amendment. And what the Hyde Amendment says is you can't use federal funding to get an abortion. And so if you are on some sort of federal program, to receive healthcare, you can't use it to get an abortion, which is, you should be allowed to use your healthcare in the way that you want to use it. And so, demands like this, putting them on the Democrats are ways that we can get into conversations with people about how we can actually fight back so we don't have this defeatist mode, which many people are now feeling.
Yeah, I think this is so important. I think obviously, people can also go back and view the latest episode that we had on abortion rights, and we've had a few actually. So obviously there's this overall kind of approach that we take to it, but I think it's so important to also have these practical solutions that we can have right now, because this is a crisis that a lot of people are going to feel personally. And it's so amazing to see kind of the fight back and the solidarity and the concrete demands that we're putting forward. And of course, all of that as a stage towards fighting for a world in which we will not need to always be fighting for our rights. We can, live for the benefit of all of us. And that is obviously socialism. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you for Tom and Claire for being with us, and obviously Toya for telling us about this. I was really looking forward to it, actually. And we are probably going to have a specific episode about Roe v. Wade next week. So please tune in and make sure that you click the bell button on YouTube as well so that you're notified when we upload it. But thank you so much, and see you soon.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!